Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Treasure Hunt. My name is Carl Skooglund, and the idea of this class, as I hope you know, is to explore the earliest known teachings of the Buddhist tradition as they're preserved in what's known as the Pali Canon, Pali being the language that the texts are written down in or preserved in. And the idea is not just to wrap our heads around all of the ideas and the concepts, and there are a lot. The idea is more to see, once we get our heads around some of the jargon, get past some of the jargon, how these teachings can be put into practice, applied in our own experience and used as a guide to leading our lives. So as part of our exploration of these 2,500-year-old teachings for about a year now, a little over a year, we've been studying the well-known Satipatthana Sutta. And in today's talk, we'll cover the portion of that teaching that is devoted to what are called the factors of awakening. And there are 7: mindfulness, investigation, energy, joy, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. And we'll go into some of them more deeply than others, but as we do so, just to know each one can be explored on its own. And we'll also talk about how there can be a natural sequence, a natural unfolding of these aspects that occurs really honestly in any sort of a sincere practice. So here we are again. We're going to explore 7 factors of awakening this morning. If you can see the screen, I have up on it one of the 2 handouts that I sent around yesterday morning. This is the one that is basically what you might call a cheat sheet for the Foundations of Mindfulness Sutta. Here are the 4 foundations that we've been contemplating for over a year now. The first foundation is the body. We've reviewed feelings. We've reviewed mind. We've been engaged in the Dhammas, the 4th foundation, for a number of months now. We've reviewed the hindrances, the aggregates, the sense spheres, and it's these 7 factors of awakening that we'll cover this morning. As you can see, we're about near the end. The last of the 4th foundations is the 4 Noble Truths, which we'll be covering next year. And now I want to share the actual text that I also sent around yesterday. And so I'll just go ahead and read this. Again, this is from Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation. And here we are, the 7 factors of awakening. All right, and so just reading. And further, a monk remains focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the 7 factors of awakening. And how does a monk remain focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the 7 factors of awakening? There is the case where there being mindfulness as a factor of awakening, being present within him, he discerns mindfulness as a factor of awakening is present within me. Or there being no mindfulness as a factor of awakening present within me, he discerns mindfulness as a factor of awakening is not present for me. And then third, he discerns how there is the arising of the unarisen mindfulness. He discerns how there is the culmination or development of mindfulness as a factor of awakening once it has arisen. And then as the text says, it doesn't go on to list the other 6. It says the same formula is repeated for analysis of qualities, which is also called investigation, persistence, energy, calm, concentration, and equanimity. We'll be using different translations for these 7 factors, but these are the ones that we encounter in this particular translation. And then following that is the 8-part refrain, which we've become familiar with as in our studies. So we'll go into all of that this morning. So on its own, this is pretty dry stuff, right? This list, it's not a story that draws you in and grips your attention. It's more like reading a set of technical instructions, right? But maybe if we think of it as being like a piece of sheet music, such that when we sing it with our own minds, then we might appreciate that we can have a really different experience of it at that point. The point at which we put these technical instructions into practice. And so we have these 7 factors, and as the text said, we're to discern if they're present or not, how they're brought about, and then once they're present, how they're brought to their culmination. And as I go through them one by one, please keep in mind that they are thought of as somewhat sequential in how they come about. It all starts with mindfulness. That's the first factor of awakening. The Pali word for mindfulness, as you may know, is sati. With that, we bring something to mind, and not just anything, but something that's going to do us some good. This is how the component of ardency comes into play, wanting something good to happen as a result of our efforts. And to zoom back out a bit, we might bring to mind and abide contemplating, our body, or feelings of pleasure and pain, or our mind states, or any of these array of teachings that we've been engaged in. It's these things that we bring to mind and clearly comprehend. Right? So there is a place for practicing choiceless awareness. But in the early tradition, mindfulness is not like a hitchhiker, and whatever happens to drive by, we hop inside and let it carry us down the road. All right, in the early tradition, mindfulness is intentional in that it settles in on something, it chooses something, and it settles in on it and stays with it and considers it deeply. So for example, we've selected something that we want to pay attention to and get smarter about. If our grocery list comes up, we don't go with that with the idea of being choiceless. Instead, we save the grocery list forever or for later, and get back to what we'd intended to focus on. Within the section of the body, we bring to mind our breathing. Not only that, in this sutta, there are particular instructions to breathe in a way that makes the body comfortable and grounds our awareness within that. And I think it could be said that this is the foundation of the foundations in a way. Having the mind comfortable within the body, settled within the body. After that, or in addition to that, the Buddha also has us bring to mind feelings of pleasure, pain, and neither. And remember that in the Buddhist teachings, we have this tendency to become attracted to pleasure, repulsed by pain, and we zone out to things that feel neutral, have a neutral tone to them. So by waking up to feeling and our tendencies, we give ourselves a chance to not get caught within the mind states of attraction, revulsion, and delusion. And with the third foundation of mindfulness, we bring to mind our states of mind, a little bit like what we were doing in the intro meditation. Mind states of attraction, revulsion, delusion, or being scattered or being dull. But we can also be clear for ourselves when our minds are expansive and caring, right? Open, relatively released. It's not just all about the pathologies. Or finally, we can bring to mind any of the array of the 5 dhammas or teachings, right? Which are the hindrances, the aggregates, the sense spheres, these 7 factors of awakening, and finally, the 4 noble truths. One thing that I think is interesting and maybe helpful to share is that in some of the very early translations of this text, we find that only the hindrances and the factors of awakening are listed in this last section. Only 2 of the typical 5 teachings. So on the one hand, we might say that these are particularly important, because in a way they do play off of each other respectively. They hinder on the one hand and help us on the other. At the same time, we might say that it's also helpful not to take this list too literally, right? So that we confine ourselves to what's listed. And what this does is that it opens to us any of the array of teachings that we connect with, any of the teachings within the tradition, and we can bring them to mind and look at them. So that is mindfulness. That's the first of the 7 factors. And once we brought something to mind, we then investigate it. The Pali word for investigation is Dhamma Vichaya. We explore something, we figure it out. At this point, we're developing wisdom. And as it says in the Anapanasati Sutta, which you might consider to be the sister teaching of the Satipatthana Sutta. The Anapanasati Sutta is the famous teaching on mindfulness of breathing. All right, in that, it says of mindfulness of, it says of investigation, it says, abiding mindful, the practitioner then investigates and examines that state with wisdom, that state being whatever we've brought to mind. We examine that state with wisdom and embark upon a full inquiry into it. So this is a description of the second factor of awakening. And broadly speaking, we investigate how and why things happen as they do within our minds. And specifically, we investigate how to free these minds of ours. And then just to say too, it's not like this whole sutta, so far it's just about what to bring to mind. It's also been directing us to investigate and explore all along. So this idea that we're abiding contemplating, which gets mentioned a lot in this sutta, it implies that we're looking into something deeply, that we're reflecting on it. Maybe even engaging in a little gentle discursive thinking. And in the refrain itself, the part of the text that we didn't actually read this morning, it outlines in the ways in which we investigate what we've brought to mind. So the first part of the refrain, for example, we explore first our own mind states, and then the mind states of others, or both. That is the idea that mind states have a universal quality. Right? Mind states can be explored, investigated as being impersonal in nature. In the next parts of the refrain, in those we explore how particular things arise, how they pass away, or how they do both. That is, how states fluctuate. And in doing so, we will definitely clue into impermanence, how things come and go. But the real benefit here is cluing into what the tradition calls conditionality. That is, how and why things happen the way they do within ourselves and with others. So that's the refrain. In the fourth Satipatthana here, this array of teachings, we also find that there are layers of investigation that bring right effort to the forefront. So with the 5 hindrances, for example, attraction, aversion, delusion, dullness, and restlessness, with them, the text has us not just notice whether they're present or not, it goes on to say that we're to understand how they arise, how they're abandoned, and how they're kept at bay. So those are the hindrances. On the other hand, with these 7 factors of awakening, the things that help us, we don't just notice whether they're present or not, we're to understand how they're brought about. And how, once they're brought about, they're maintained and developed. So that's mindfulness and investigation, the first 2 factors. I'm going to go through the remaining factors pretty quickly. And in my own experience, at least, I think that once we become really familiar and comfortable with the tools of inquiry, with the tools of insight, at that point, we've kind of got the wind at our backs. And the rest of the factors can kind of take on their own natural momentum. So next factor after investigation is energy, right? This act of investigating can be exciting, and it leads to this 3rd factor, which is a helpful kind of energy. The Pali word for that is viriya. So this energy comes from us starting to figure things out. It's enlivening when that happens. It's the basic excitement of learning, right? Of cluing into things that we didn't know before. It's like some detective story, and it's that part of the detective story, where we find a clue. And as you probably know, the meditator's version of this feeling is of getting an insight into something. Following on this is a kind of happiness. The fourth factor, the Pali word for joy is piti. And I think the ironic thing with this is that even if we're cluing into something difficult, there can be a kind of a happiness, a kind of joy in that, just in becoming clear for ourselves what's happening. Now, after the 4th factor, we take an interesting turn, I think. The mind can be satisfied with the energy and the happiness for a period of time, but then they can be experienced as a bit intense. And the mind can have a feeling of being a bit oversaturated. And at that point, it kind of naturally sees the value of being a little more restful. And this is where we transition from energy and happiness to tranquility. The Pali word is passaddhi. The mind switches from being energized to being more settled. And it's this kind of tranquility that you might have experienced from, simply accomplishing something. Once happy and tranquil, the mind can slip into concentration. The Pali word is samadhi. Now, it can mean going into a very deep kind of concentration known as jhana. And just to say that sometimes concentration can get a little bit of a bad rap these days because it can have the connotation of striving. Concentration can have the connotation of trying to pound a nail into a piece of wood, and mind being the hammer. And that kind of striving is something that a lot of contemporary teachers say we're not supposed to do. Concentration can also have the connotation of blocking things out, putting blinders on, which is also, cannot be so helpful. And plus, with our lives being as busy as they are, teaching deep concentration can seem like just setting people up for failure. Our life situations just don't support that kind of experience. So all that being said, I think what is a good way to think of concentration is that it's pointing to this notable transition that can happen in our minds when we come into a state of deeper serenity. The mind becomes noticeably unified, noticeably collected. Even if it's not full-blown jhana, it's still enough of a change of state that we might have this recognition, whoa, this is really different. This is really different than how my mind usually is. And then one thing to point out too is that it's not like we're just now getting to of having been settled, coming into a settled state, because in the mindfulness investigation and investigation portions above, there can't be a total lack of concentration. There can't be a total lack of settledness, right? There needed to have been enough stillness in the mind so that the mind could see clearly, investigate, be mindful, be mindful. There needs to have been enough stillness so that what it's investigating can be seen clearly. There's a verse in the Dhammapada, verse 372. It says, "There is no wisdom without concentration. There is no concentration without wisdom. And when one has both, one is close to freedom." So both are mutually supporting. When one is happening, there is some sort of piece of the other with it. And I like to think of this stillness myself as what a seed needs in order to sprout. It can have all the other things that it needs: the water, the soil, the warmth, the light, but it also needs to be still for a period of time and to sprout. So concentration is the sixth factor. The seventh is equanimity. The Pali word for equanimity is upekkha. In its ultimate sense, this points to the equanimity of the fourth jhana, the fourth stage of concentration, of being highly concentrated, which, according to the early tradition, puts us on the very cusp of ultimate release. At this point, the mind is unwavering, perfectly poised and composed. Right? We've seen past the little enticements of the mundane life. We've even seen past the enticements of sort of the very rare forms of spiritual pleasure. We've seen past even those. There's no more inclination of the mind to concoct, to just kind of make things up. No more inclination to fabricate, as the tradition says. And the mind, in the ultimate sense, at this point, is ready to let go. Interesting thing is, sometimes equanimity portrayed as the goal itself, the goal of the path, but it is in fact just another tool leading to the release of the mind. And now, even if we're not at the cusp of this perhaps seemingly mythological awakening, in our own practice, we still can see, nevertheless, that the mind can turn imperturbable. It's another one of those states that just maybe didn't seem possible before. It's a kind of balance that the mind can come into that we just didn't think we could come into. So those are the 7 factors. And that's a lot. And as with talks, I tend to throw a lot of ideas at you at one time. And I can easily imagine that if you're new to the tradition or new to the early texts, that this presentation brings about quite the opposite of tranquility. All right, but again, just to say, once you put this into practice, all of the hazy complexity starts to come into clear view. It's a really different thing at that point, and it's not just a matter of trying to keep all these doggone lists in your head. The thing to remember, or maybe to have a little bit of faith in, if you're new, is that these are not theoretical constructs. We can think of these 7 factors as signposts of actual events in the mind. They point to something that we can have in our actual experience. Also, as the text points out, we're not just to leave these attributes to chance, to watch them come and watch them go, take that kind of approach. Instead, they are to be developed. We're encouraged to develop these, make them reliable skills. But as I'm kind of saying too, they're not skills that have to be imposed. They can unfold naturally, but just by keeping at the practice. But as they happen, again, you can refer back to this teaching and say, oh, that's what was going on. Also, in terms of our actual practice, I think it can really help to bring all of these ideas together and gather them around one topic, around one theme. So rather than being very broadly mindful, instead we can bring something to mind in particular, something we can select, something that we'd like to get a little more freedom around. Something that typically hounds, dogs us, whatever canine analogy you want to use. We can, as I like to say, bring to mind, for example, our very favorite hindrance. The one that our mind tends to do the most, attraction, aversion, dullness or restlessness or confusion. One that hinders us the most, we can turn into an object of mindfulness and investigate it. Or recalling an image from our last class, you can bring to mind your favorite mango, right? A person or a situation that typically triggers you. It causes one or several of the hindrances to arise, and sets your mind to proliferating. Sets the mind to storytelling and going on and on. As the 7 factors set out, we bring to mind this particular issue and then we investigate it. Right? As the Anapanasati Sutta said, we examine that state with wisdom and embark upon a full inquiry into it. And so this exercise may take place over one meditation or several meditations, something you can reflect on in your otherwise quiet moments, not just in formal practice. As a particular example of investigation, I want to suggest as a theme for exploration, how we might get caught in what the tradition calls clinging to views. So again, just we're honing in on and bringing to mind and investigating a particular something that might give us a hard time. So I'm offering up this idea that we cling to views. It's interesting. This is actually a theme that arises a lot in the early texts. Clinging to views. And so you may have had, I'm joking, you may have had in your life where you encounter opinions and points of view that differ from your own, right? this is life, right? And another fact of life is that people, latch on to opinions and views, and we get into all kinds of fights about opinions and views. In fact, this seems to be the default setting for most of us. Basically, we get upset with people who disagree with us. So if you were at the last class, getting back to the mango reference, we went over a quick story called The Flight of the Beasts. And in that story, The Flight of the Beasts, a mango falls on top of the lair of a little hare, a little rabbit. It makes a loud sound, and the hare thinks that the world is coming to an end. And so the hare bolts out of his hole and he runs frantically through the forest. He eventually causes a stampede among the other animals of the forest. And the analogy is that we may find that our own minds stampede when we get impacted by some sort of a mango, you might say. That is an opinion or a view that we disagree with. So we come into contact with that view that we disagree with, and then our minds proliferate, run around frantically. The mango may in the form of an email, may come in the form of a headline, some posting on social media. It's an interaction at work or at home or with friends. It wouldn't surprise me too if here in this Dharma class, I may present some view that doesn't sit quite right with you. This is just how it is, right? What's interesting though is that these particular disagreements, they may last just a moment or a few moments. But as you might be aware, our minds tend to draw out the interaction for many moments, perhaps days, maybe years. It might become an ongoing theme in our trains of thought, maybe even an obsession. Well, the tradition tells us that we can look into this, we can question this. We can bring to mind this tendency of the mind, and then we can abide contemplating it, as it says here in the Satipatthana. And if we look back at the section on the hindrances again, it sets out a really basic, really helpful array of fundamental questions, fundamental inquiries, in regard to the 5 states of mind that typically give us a hard time. The first inquiry for each of the 5 hindrances is, what is present? Right? Is something present? The second inquiry is something not present? Third, how is it that the hindrance or whatever it is has come about? How has it arisen? And then, how is it that something might be abandoned, let go of? And then finally, how might that something be kept at bay, prevented from bothering us in the future? So 5 inquiries with each of the 5 hindrances. So keeping in mind that the second factor of awakening, investigation, inquiry, we can ask ourselves fundamental questions, when we find ourselves getting attached to our views, clinging to our views. Now, I've found that, the texts give us these questions. They give us a basic outline of how to work with investigation, but it's best to adjust the questioning to suit our own personalities and to suit our specific situations, right? We shouldn't take the formula too seriously. We shouldn't cling to the formula. So there's a little bit of just, playful aspect that we can bring into the investigation. And one of the ways that I've looked at investigation over the years is that we become good at asking ourselves questions. We become good at what you might say is interviewing our own mind. And the tone of the questioning, the tone of the interviewing is important, I think. We don't want to be a hostile interviewer. And it seems that the best approach to our questioning is to come at it with an attitude of genuine interest and curiosity. We can be relaxed about, this questioning. Again, be playful with it. At the same time, we may also find that this takes a little bit of courage, and that we might have to ask ourselves hard questions, because maybe we have something going on that might be a little hard to admit to ourselves. So getting to this idea of investigating, bringing to mind and investigating views. The first question with that is, if it's present, what is it that exactly is happening when I'm clinging to an proliferating about a view? So, for example, what body sensations might be present? Right? You may notice that there's tension, there's heat in the body, the breath gets short. We can also ask, when I'm clinging, when I'm proliferating, what specific kind of pleasure or satisfaction am I trying to gain or maintain? That can take some time just to be clear for ourselves what that is. What's the pleasure we're going after? Or on the other hand, what sort of pain am I trying to avoid when the mind is proliferating, clinging? Next, in regard to, again, just figuring out what is present when we're clinging to views, we can see what sorts of perceptions we might be applying to the situation. What sorts of perceptions might we apply to other people, to a group of people, to the situation? If I am clinging to a view, there is some sort of contrasting view that I'm setting myself up in opposition to. Right? And there's also this sort of rudimentary labeling, that other views are, you might say, dumb or stupid or ignorant or immoral. Right? There can be the rudimentary view of labeling a group or person as other. Right? So we can wake up also after that to the specific trains of thought that arise when we're clinging to views. Trains of thought along the lines of just exclamations, like, how could you think that? Right? And more generally, you can notice how we might spend time cobbling together, facts that justify our own view, or falsify the view of someone else. Right? We wake up to all this. This first part of the investigation is just, what is it exactly that's going on? Being very, granular as we can in our investigation. Second inquiry, again, drawing off of what we find with the hindrances. The second inquiry is, how is it that I came into this clinging to views? How did it come about? As we learned in the last class, there's this little, very quick interaction that we can notice. And that is that we have the raw experience of coming into contact with something. In this case, we come into contact with another point of view. And our minds immediately apply a label, a perception to that point of view. That's the first part. And the second part, right alongside that, it rides with it. There's a corresponding feeling of that point of view. So the perception and the feeling of the point of view being irritating or being pleasant. If this seems abstract, I think what we're really describing simply is our having a gut reaction to something. The tradition is describing a gut reaction. Check out how this works the next time you scan a headline. Right? This gut reaction, this is a key moment in our everyday experience. This, say, is our past karma coming into play. We walk around with habitual views and opinions, past associations, old thinking patterns, and then when we come into contact with something, we have a gut reaction. And then we are, as one sutta says, beset by an onslaught of proliferation. Okay? And when we're proliferating, going on and on, creating stories in our heads, endlessly fine-tuning our arguments, right? One way that I put it to myself is that the mind, sees or perceives that there's a problem. And what the mind is trying to do is to solve that problem, trying to fix it. This is what the tradition calls the attraction, the allure, you might say, of clinging to views, is that we have a chance to solve a problem. We have a chance to fix someone else's opinion. And of course, another layer to this, and it's especially true when we're having an actual interaction with somebody, not just passively reading something. When we're in an actual interaction, we can perceive that somebody's not just attacking my argument, they're attacking me. They're attacking the key word is my point of view. So again, we're questioning, how clinging to views arises. Well, a big part of that can be is that we're not just trying to defend a view, we're trying to defend ourselves. We're trying to defend our self-image at that point. The image we want to maintain of ourselves as being the one who is right, not wrong. But one way of relaxing our clinging is to ask ourselves, is it really a problem that I need to solve? Right? Or do I really need to take this so personally? So these kinds of questions lead us to the third investigation. Is the clinging necessary? Might this clinging be let go of? Right? We've discovered what it is, how it arises. The third question is, how might this be let go of? Might there be an escape from the little mental worlds that we concoct inside our heads when we're proliferating? So, again, here's one big question we can ask, that might help the mind to relax. The question being, do I really need to fix someone else's opinion in order for me to feel okay within myself? Or, put another way, we can reflect on the drawback of having our own sense of well-being tied to or yoked to what goes on inside somebody else's head. And with this, we simply see the dukkha of how that kind of latching onto, how that hurts. And then with that, we might in turn see the value of being released from the grip of that. We might see the value at that point in letting go. And then finally, the fourth question, is if I wanted to not be drawn into this anymore in the future, or at least not so easily, what might I do? And in kind of mulling this over, two two ways of viewing it came to mind. Two ways of framing it came to mind. The first is that we can do what the tradition calls guarding our senses, which, as you may recall, is simply a matter of keeping close track of what the mind makes of all the stimulus that comes our way. Right, in those initial moments, right, those initial gut reacting moments, we keep close track of what our mind makes when we encounter views and opinions in life. And then if we're clear about it, we have the chance to not get on that train, not get into that passing car. The second option to, helping ourselves not get drawn into it to begin with is to exercise a little bit of what the tradition calls renunciation. And again, renunciation is an idea that often gets a bad rap. But really what it's talking about is just, not letting ourselves, choosing to do better for ourselves. And so in this case, renunciation may mean that we don't look at our phones so much. Right? We can make those decisions in the moment, not to follow the compulsion to just see what's going on, pick up that phone once again. Right? We may have a tendency to do so, but we can create a more healthy direction for ourselves, a more healthy habit for us instead. So that's the mindfulness and investigation part of exploring clinging to views. And as I kind of mentioned before, once you've cracked the code of the insight part of it, I think that there's a natural energy and joy that can come with that. The other factors tend to follow quite naturally. And then following on that, there's also a quite natural tranquility and stability. So that is how the 7 factors of awakening can unfold in our practice. And that's all I wanted to say for this morning, offer up this morning. I thank you for your attention, and I hope it's been helpful.